Greetings, warriors and dreamers. Welcome to the realms of sleep, where tonight we journey through the epic world of God of War. I am your guide through the 9 realms, where ancient gods whisper their secrets and mythic landscapes unfold before us. From the frost-covered mountains of Midgard to the golden halls of Asgard, these tales of gods and giants will carry you into peaceful slumber. Lay down your weapons, rest your weary head, and allow the legends of these powerful beings to become the landscape of your dreams. The battles have been fought, and now is the time for rest. So close your eyes, brave one. Let the fire of the hearth warm you as we begin our journey through realms both wondrous and dangerous. Twilight settled over Vanaheim like gentle hands drawing a blanket across the sky. Atreus walked alone through forests unknown to most mortals, his bow slung across his back and his footsteps nearly silent on the moss-covered ground. The air smelled of pine and something sweeter, night-blooming flowers opening their petals to welcome the first stars. It had been 3 days since he'd separated from his father. A planned divergence in their journey meant to gather information from different sources before reuniting at the edge of the realm. The separation had been Mimir's suggestion, surprisingly supported by Kratos after initial reluctance. The boy must learn to navigate unfamiliar territory alone, his father had said, voice gruff but tinged with what Atreus had come to recognize as concealed pride. And the Vanir forests respond differently to different bloodlines. This acknowledgement of Atreus's Jotnar heritage, inherited from his mother Faye, had become more frequent as their journeys progressed, a subtle shift from the days when his father had seemed almost reluctant to discuss his mixed lineage. Mimir, still serving as their advisor despite being reduced to a reanimated head, had provided what guidance he could before Atreus departed. The deeper reaches of Vanaheim operate by different rules than the outskirts we've explored together, the former advisor to Odin had explained. Time flows inconsistently there, and directions become suggestions rather than absolutes. Trust your instincts more than your eyes, lad. Kratos will be fine, Atreus reassured himself, though no concern for his father's safety truly troubled him. The god of war needed no protection. That much had been proven countless times. Rather, Atreus found the silence around him unusually complete without his father's deep voice, or Mimir's constant chatter. Here in the deepening dusk, with only forest sounds for company, he felt both the freedom and the weight of solitude. The journey so far had been surprisingly peaceful. Unlike their previous ventures through hostile territories, swarming with Draugr, revenants, or other dangers, this region of Vanaheim seemed almost deliberately serene. Atreus had encountered few creatures larger than rabbits and birds, though occasionally he glimpsed what appeared to be deer with phosphorescent antlers, watching him from distances too great for proper identification. These gentle encounters felt like acknowledgement rather than threat, recognition of his passage, without judgment or alarm. He'd made good use of the quiet travel time, practicing techniques his father had taught him for maintaining awareness while conserving energy. Walking for hours without tiring, observing without fixating, remaining alert without tension. These skills had developed gradually over their many journeys together, transforming Atreus from the easily exhausted boy who had begun their first expedition to the young man who now navigated unfamiliar territory with growing confidence. As he walked, Atreus occasionally paused to note landmarks in a small journal tucked securely at his belt, another habit learned from Faye, who had always kept careful record of her explorations. These notes weren't merely practical documentation, but a way of processing observations, connecting patterns that might otherwise remain scattered impressions. Yesterday he'd noticed how certain trees leaned consistently toward what should have been west, despite wind patterns suggesting they should bend northward. Today he'd observed birds flying in formations that seemed too deliberate for natural behavior, their movements resembling runes momentarily sketched against the sky before dispersing. The boy, no, young man now, paused at a ridge overlooking a valley carpeted in silver-blue vegetation that seemed to capture and hold the fading twilight. Vanaheim's forests differed from those near their cavern. Here the trees grew taller, their canopies spreading wider, their trunks adorned with luminescent fungi that began to glow as darkness descended. Unlike the harsh winters of their home, this realm maintained a perpetual state between spring and summer, the air warm enough for comfort, yet cool enough to keep a traveler alert. Atreus consulted the rough map Freya had reluctantly provided, a peace offering of sorts, though the truce between the former Queen of the Valkyries and Kratos remained fragile at best. The parchment showed markings for a sacred site nearby, described only as the garden where stars rest. According to Freya, it contained knowledge about the connections between realms that might prove useful in their ongoing efforts to understand the changes coming to the Nine Realms. Should be just ahead, Atreus murmured, orienting himself by the twin peaks visible against the darkening sky. He folded the map carefully and continued his descent into the valley, where mist had begun to gather between the trees like spun silver. The light from the fungi illuminated his path in soft blue patches, creating the impression that he walked upon stars fallen to earth. As he ventured deeper into the valley, Atreus noted subtle changes in his surroundings. The trees grew more deliberately spaced, their arrangement suggesting intention rather than natural growth. Flowers bloomed in circular patterns around certain trees, their colors shifting subtly as he passed. Most tellingly, the random scatter of rocks had given way to purposefully placed stones, not quite a path, but suggestive of one, as if encouraging certain directions of travel without demanding them. The air grew warmer despite the approaching evening, carrying scents that reminded Atreus of his mother's garden, earthy and floral, with underlying notes of something ancient and immutable. He noticed small pools of water appearing more frequently, their surfaces perfectly still and reflective, like polished silver mirrors. When he glanced into one such pool, his reflection looked back with an expression slightly different from what he felt on his own face. More serene, perhaps, or wiser than his years would suggest. Bird songs changed as well, transitioning from the familiar calls of forest dwellers to more complex melodies that seemed almost conversational in their patterns. Occasionally these songs would pause as he passed, resuming with subtle variations once he'd moved beyond, as if commenting on his presence, or perhaps sharing observations about this visitor with others beyond his perception. Most remarkable were the mushrooms that appeared in increasing numbers, their caps glowing with colors that shifted according to no pattern Atreus could discern. Some reached nearly to his waist, forming circles that reminded him of stories Mimiri had shared about fairy rings in other realms. Unlike the potentially dangerous growth found in more ominous territories, these fungi emanated a sense of benevolent awareness, their glow brightening slightly whenever he approached, as if acknowledging his presence with gentle welcome. "Definitely getting close," he whispered, instinctively lowering his voice though no other person walked nearby. Something about the arrangement of trees and stones suggested reverence was appropriate, a quality of sacred space that transcended specific religious traditions. Kratos had taught him to recognize such places, not to worship them, but to respect the power that often resided in locations where the natural world thinned between realms. The mist thickened as Atreus continued forward, swirling around his ankles and occasionally forming shapes that might have been figures dancing just at the edge of vision. He maintained steady progress, guided by intuition as much as by landmarks now, until the mist parted suddenly to reveal a perfect circular glade, ringed with silver-leafed trees, unlike any he had seen before in Vanaheim. Atreus stopped at the threshold, breath catching in his throat. At the center of the glade lay a pool perhaps 20 feet across, its surface perfectly still, yet somehow giving the impression of gentle movement. The water glowed with soft blue-white light that seemed to come from depths far greater than the pool's size should allow. Around this luminous water, concentric circles of stone created a series of winding paths between carefully tended gardens, where plants of incredible delicacy and beauty grew. "The moon well," Atreus whispered, recognizing the place from fragments of stories Mimir had shared during their travels. These rare pools were said to be tears shed by the moon itself, collected in sacred bowls crafted by the Vanya in the first days of creation. Their waters contained memories and dreams, preserved like insects in amber, accessible to those who knew how to listen properly. Silver petals drifted lazily through the air, detaching from the surrounding trees to spiral downward in patterns too deliberate to be caused by mere wind. As Atreus watched, several petals landed on the moonwell's surface, but instead of floating, they seemed to dissolve into the water, releasing small bursts of light like tiny stars being born. He hesitated at the edge of the glade, remembering Freya's warning. The garden responds to intent, not footsteps. Enter with turmoil in your heart and you will find only confusion. Enter with clarity and the paths will reveal themselves. At the time, he had dismissed this as typically cryptic Vanir advice, but standing before the moonwell's glow, he sensed truth in her words. Atreus closed his eyes briefly, centering himself as Kratos had taught him. He focused on his breathing, in through the nose, out through the mouth, until the excitement of discovery settled into appreciation. When he opened his eyes and stepped into the glade, the silver leaves above him rustled in what sounded remarkably like welcome. The closest path consisted of flat white stones arranged in a winding pattern leading toward the moonwell. As Atreus set foot on the first stone, he noticed how it seemed to brighten slightly beneath his step. The next stone did the same, creating the impression that the path itself responded to his presence, illuminating just enough to guide without overwhelming the garden's natural ambience. As he followed the brightening stones, Atreus observed the gardens between the paths more closely. Plants he had never seen before grew in careful arrangements, their forms suggesting both aesthetic and practical considerations. Some bore fruits that glowed like miniature moons. Others displayed blossoms that opened and closed in sequence as he passed, as if tracking his movement. Still, others seemed composed entirely of light given physical form, their translucent leaves revealing intricate patterns of luminous veins. The path curved gently, leading not directly to the moonwell, but around it in a gradually narrowing spiral. Atreus realized the design intended for visitors to experience the entire garden before reaching the central pool, each section apparently dedicated to different aspects of Vanir knowledge and history. In one section, plants grew in formations that clearly represented constellations. In another, flowers bloomed in color patterns that suggested seasonal cycles. A third contained what appeared to be a living calendar, with different plants marking specific celestial events through their growth patterns and flowering time. It's a library, Atreus realized, remembering how Mimir had explained that the Vanir rarely recorded their knowledge in books or scrolls. Instead, they encoded wisdom into living things, plants, animals, landscapes themselves, creating repositories of knowledge that remain dynamic rather than static, evolving alongside the people who tended them. As he rounded a curve in the path, Atreus noticed a soft glow that didn't come from the plants or stones. Hovering just above a particularly beautiful arrangement of silver-poop flowers was a small orb of light, no larger than his palm, pulsing gently with a pearlescent luminescence. As he approached, the orb drifted slightly higher, maintaining distance while clearly acknowledging his presence. "Hello," Atreus said quietly, stopping a respectful distance away. "I mean no harm to this place." The orb pulsed more intensely for a moment, then expanded slightly before contracting again. No words were spoken, yet Atreus distinctly felt an impression of curiosity directed toward him. Simultaneously, the light shifted color slightly, taking on a questioning bluish tint. A moonshade wisp, he identified, remembering Mimir's descriptions of the mysterious beings that sometimes served as guardians for Vanir's sacred sites. Neither truly alive in the conventional sense, nor simply magical constructs, wisps existed as concentrations of intention and awareness, capable of complex communication despite lacking physical forms for speech. The wisp drifted closer, circling Atreus once before moving ahead along the path, its light dimming and brightening in a pattern that clearly invited him to follow. He did so, noting how the garden around him seemed to respond to the wisp's presence, flowers turning toward it like miniature suns, luminous fruits glowing more intensely as it passed. "Are you the guardian here?" Atreus asked as he followed, not expecting words in response, but knowing the wisp would understand his meaning. The light pulsed once, affirmative, then shifted to a more complex pattern of colors that conveyed concepts rather than simple yes or no. Atreus received impressions of tending, welcoming, preserving, all blended into a role more nuanced than mere guarding. The wisp didn't simply protect the garden from intruders, it maintained the garden's purpose as a place of communion between visitors and knowledge. Guided by the wisp, Atreus continued along the stone path as it wound through increasingly elaborate sections of the garden. In one area, plants grew in formations that depicted historical events, a living tapestry of Vanir history expressed through carefully arranged vegetation. In another, flowers released harmonious tones when their petals caught the breeze, creating subtle music that changed as he walked past. As they progressed deeper into the garden, Atreus noticed how the light from the moonwell seemed to follow specific channels through the ground beneath the paths, creating an intricate network of illumination that connected all parts of the garden to its central source. These channels pulsed with gentle rhythm that matched his own heartbeat when he walked in harmony with the garden's flow, but quickened or slowed when his pace fell out of alignment with the space's natural cadence. "The garden breathes," he murmured, recognizing patterns similar to what his mother had described in her teachings about living spaces, how certain locations possessed their own rhythms that responsive travelers could synchronize with for mutual benefit. Faye had shown him how to identify such places near their home, though none had demonstrated rhythms as distinct as what he felt here. The wisp bobbed slightly in what appeared to be confirmation, its light momentarily intensifying before resuming its previous gentle glow. It continued leading him through sections of increasing complexity, gardens where plants responded to shadow patterns by changing color, areas where minute atmospheric shifts triggered cascades of sequential blossoming, spaces where growth patterns formed equations describing celestial movements too complex for conventional notation. Throughout it all, the moonwell remained visible at the center, its glow seemingly brighter now that night had fully claimed the sky above. Stars appeared in the gaps between silver-leaved branches, their light mingling with the pool's radiance to create an environment where boundaries between earth and sky, water and air, seemed less definite than in the world outside. The wisp led Atreus to a small clearing adjacent to the main spiral path, where a semicircle of stone seats faced a vertical slab of pale marble veined with silver. The slab stood empty, its surface smooth and reflective in the moonwell's light, yet something about its positioning suggested it served as a focal point for this area. When Atreus glanced questioningly at the wisp, it pulsed in colors that conveyed patience and expectation. He understood that something was meant to happen here, though what exactly remained unclear. Taking the implicit invitation, he seated himself on the central stone, facing the marble slab. For several moments, nothing changed. The marble remained blank, the garden continued its subtle movements around him, and the wisp hovered nearby, its light steady and encouraging. Atreus fought a rising sense of impatience, a trait inherited from his father that occasionally undermined his natural curiosity and observational skills. "What am I supposed to see?" he finally asked, unable to contain his frustration. The moment the words left his mouth, Atreus noticed something strange. The path he had followed to reach this spot seemed to shift, its stones rearranging themselves subtly until they formed a perfect circle rather than continuing toward the moonwell. He stood and walked to the path's edge, only to discover that following it would simply lead him back to where he now stood. The wisp pulsed with gentle admonishment, its colors suggesting that his impatience had altered the garden's response to him. Atreus remembered Freya's warning about the garden responding to intent rather than footsteps. His momentary frustration had manifested physically, creating a loop from which progress seemed impossible. "I understand," he said, both to the wisp and to himself. "The garden changes with my thoughts." The wisp brightened in affirmation, then drifted back toward the stone seat, clearly suggesting he try again with a different approach. Atreus returned to the seat, contemplating how to proceed. Kratos had often emphasized the importance of patience and observation, waiting for the right moment rather than forcing situations through sheer determination. Closing his eyes, Atreus focused on calming his mind, letting go of expectations about what should happen or when. He thought of the still surface of the moonwell, of the gentle drift of silver petals, of the steady rhythm of his own breathing. Gradually, he felt something shift within and around him. Not the garden's physical configuration this time, but a more subtle alignment between his awareness and the place itself. When he opened his eyes again, the marble slab before him had changed. Moonlight from above and the moonwell's glow from behind converged on its surface, revealing intricate patterns that hadn't been visible before. These patterns slowly coalesced into recognizable images, figures, landscapes, symbols, like a story being written in light upon the stone. The wisp drifted closer to Atreus, its colors shifting to convey satisfaction and encouragement. He leaned forward, studying the images as they formed more completely. A tale was unfolding before him, though portions of it seemed missing or faded, requiring him to intuit connections between the visible segments. The story began with an image of a young Vanir woman gathering water from what appeared to be the very moonwell where Atreus now sat. As she collected the luminous liquid in a silver vessel, her reflection in the water showed not her own face, but that of a much older woman, a glimpse of her future self that startled her into nearly dropping the vessel. The next image showed the same woman traveling through landscapes Atreus recognized from his journey through Vanaheim, valleys and forests similar to those he had traversed to reach the garden. She carried the vessel of moonwell water carefully, using it occasionally to water plants that then grew with extraordinary vitality and beauty. A gap appeared in the narrative here, a section where the light failed to reveal clear images. Atreus sensed this wasn't a flaw in the marble or the light, but an intentional omission, a part of the story he was meant to discover through his own intuition rather than direct showing. The tale resumed with the woman, now visibly older, standing before a gathering of Vanir in what appeared to be a time of crisis. Darkness encroached around the edges of the scene, and many of the gathered figures showed signs of injury or distress. The woman raised the vessel, now only half hell of the luminous water, as if offering it as solution to whatever calamity had befallen her people. Another gap followed, larger than the first, leaving Etrion uncertain about the outcome of this critical moment. When the images resumed, they showed the garden itself taking form. Trees being planted, stones arranged, the moonwell established, or perhaps renewed. The woman, now in the winter of her life, appeared to be directing these efforts, though many hands joined in the creation. The final image showed the garden complete, with the old woman seated beside the moonwell. From her hands rose the first moonshade wisp, the very being Atreus suspected that now hovered beside him. As the wisp formed, the woman herself seemed to fade, becoming translucent and eventually merging with the garden itself, her essence becoming part of the place she had created. As the last image faded, leaving the marble slab blank once more, Atreus sat in thoughtful silence. The tale was beautiful but incomplete, the missing sections creating questions that lingered in his mind. He turned to the wisp, which had remained nearby throughout the viewing. "What happened during the gaps?" he asked. "Why isn't the whole story shown?" The wisp's colors shifted to suggest that the missing portions were not lost but protected, accessible only to those who could attune themselves deeply enough to the garden's essence. The impression Atreus received wasn't one of secrecy for its own sake, but rather of wisdom that could only be fully understood through personal realization rather than passive observation. The concept reminded him of how his father taught combat skills. Certain techniques couldn't be properly learned through demonstration alone, but required direct experience to truly comprehend. Show, don't tell, had been Kratos' approach, often placing Atreus in controlled situations where he needed to discover solutions rather than simply following instructions. Those lessons had occasionally frustrated the younger Atreides, eager for direct answers, but he'd gradually recognized the wisdom in this approach as discovered knowledge became integrated understanding rather than merely memorized information. "So I need to experience it rather than just see it," Atreus murmured, the wisp brightening in confirmation. This approach felt distinctly Vanir in its philosophy. Their magic had always emphasized harmonious interaction with natural forces, rather than the domination frequently practiced by the Aesir, where Odin sought to possess knowledge controlling it through runes and bindings. The Vanir traditionally became vassals for wisdom, allowing it to flow through them rather than attempting to contain it. The garden itself embodied this philosophical difference. Unlike the rigid hierarchical structures favored by Aesir architecture, designed to impress and intimidate through scale and grandeur, this space invited participation and discovery through its very design. It didn't present knowledge as absolute truth to be accepted, but as living possibility to be engaged with personally. Atreus thought of his mother again, how she had maintained this balance in her teachings, providing structure while allowing him space to discover, offering guidance without imposing limitations. Though raised among the Jotnar rather than the Vanir, Fae had shared their reverence for wisdom that transformed, rather than information that merely accumulated. Understanding dawned gradually. "I need to connect with the garden more deeply to see the rest," he murmured. The wisp brightened in affirmation. Atreus considered how to proceed. His initial approach of simply waiting and watching had revealed part of the story, but clearly something more active was required to access its hidden portions. He thought of his father's teachings about meditation, not merely quieting the mind, but actively directing awareness in specific ways to achieve particular states of consciousness. With new purpose, he closed his eyes again, but this time, instead of emptying his mind of thoughts, he focused intently on the story he had witnessed. He visualized the Vanir woman, imagined the weight of the silver vessel in his own hands, felt the cool touch of the moonwell water, sensed the responsibility of carrying something so precious across long distances. As his concentration deepened, Atreus became aware of subtle sounds around him. The gentle chime of wind through crystalline flowers nearby, the soft lapping of the moonwell against its stone basin, the whisper of silver leaves overhead. These sounds gradually organized themselves into patterns that felt meaningful, though not in any language he consciously understood. When he opened his eyes, the world had changed. The garden remained physically the same, but his perception of it had transformed. Colors appeared more vivid, the movements of plants more deliberate, the patterns of light and shadow more significant. Most notably, faint translucent figures moved among the gardens. Not fully manifested spirits, but impressions of past presences, memories preserved in the fabric of the place itself. The marble slab now glowed more intensely, and when Atreus focused on it, new images formed, filling precisely the gaps that had existed in the previous telling. The first missing segment showed what had happened after the woman received the glimpse of her future self in the moonwell's reflection. Rather than being frightened by this vision, she had sought understanding through communing with the well, placing her hands upon its surface and receiving knowledge that set her on the path shown in subsequent images. The water she gathered wasn't taken merely for its power, but with permission and purpose, to preserve the moonwell's essence during a time of coming darkness. Her journey through Vanaheim involved creating safe havens, small gardens that would preserve fragments of Vanir wisdom should the worst come to pass. The second, larger gap revealed the nature of the crisis that had befallen the Vanir. A great drought had come to Vanaheim, one that withered even the most robust enchanted plants, and threatened the realm's fundamental connection to natural magic. The darkness Atreus had seen encroaching represented not an enemy attack, but the desperate fear that had taken hold as the Vanir faced the unprecedented failure of their deepest connections to the natural world. The woman's offering of the moonwell water hadn't been a simple gesture, but the culmination of careful preparation. She had discovered that the water, properly used, could restore the broken connections between the Vanir and their realm's innate magic, but the restoration required sacrifice, specifically the gradual surrender of her own life force to catalyze the healing process. The final gap showed her decision to transform the garden into a living repository of knowledge, a place where future generations could rediscover what might otherwise be lost during difficult times. Her merging with the garden and creation of the first wisp hadn't been merely symbolic, but a literal transference of consciousness into a new form of existence, becoming the garden's guiding awareness, rather than simply passing from life. As the completed story faded from the marble, Atreus felt a profound sense of connection, not just to the tale itself, but to the garden around him, and, by extension, to Vanaheim as a whole. He understood now that the garden existed not merely as a place of beauty or even knowledge, but as a living testament to sacrifice made in service of continuity, wisdom preserved through transformation rather than mere recording. She became the garden, he said softly, looking at the wisp with new understanding. Or part of it, at least. And you're an extension of her awareness, aren't you? The wisp pulsed in a complex pattern that confirmed his insight while suggesting the reality was both simpler and more complicated than human language could easily express. The woman's consciousness had indeed merged with the garden, but that merging represented evolution rather than ending, becoming something greater rather than ceasing to be herself. With this deeper understanding established, the path that had previously formed a closed loop now unfolded once more, continuing its spiral toward the moonwell at the garden's center. The wisp drifted ahead, clearly indicating that Atreides had earned the right to approach the well itself. As he followed the now illuminated path, Atreus reflected on how the garden's lesson mirrored much of what his father had tried to teach him about patience and perception. Kratos often emphasized that understanding came not from demanding answers, but from developing the capacity to recognize them when they appeared. A philosophy the garden embodied in its very design. The trees around him seemed to lean closer as he passed, their silver leaves rustling in patterns too consistent for random wind. Occasionally a leaf would detach and spiral downward to land precisely in his path, dissolving into momentary illumination beneath his next step. These subtle acknowledgments created the impression of conversation without words, the garden responding to his growing attunement with increasing receptivity. Flowers along the path bloomed in sequence as he approached, their petals opening to reveal luminous centers that pulsed briefly before closing again after he passed. These blossoms released scents that triggered fleeting memories. His mother's garden after spring rain, mountain herbs gathered during expeditions with Kratos, evening fires where Mimir shared stories of ancient times. The associations felt deliberately evoked rather than random recollection, as if the garden sought connection through personal experience rather than abstract concept. The path finally reached the edge of the moonwell, completing its spiral journey at the garden's heart. Up close, the pool proved even more extraordinary than it had appeared from a distance. Its surface remained perfectly still, yet gave the impression of constant motion beneath, like thoughts flowing beneath the calm face of deep meditation. The blue-white light emanated not just from the water, but seemed to exist within it, illuminating from within rather than reflecting from without. Small, delicate plants grew around the well's stone rim, their roots extending down to touch the luminous water. These plants bore tiny flowers that opened and closed in patterns, suggesting communication rather than random movement. The stone basin itself was inscribed with runes that shifted positions when not directly observed, rearranging themselves into new configurations that altered their meaning in subtle but significant ways. The wisp hovered at the pool's edge, its light reflecting on the water's surface to create patterns of increasing complexity. Through these patterns, Atreus received an invitation, not expressed in words but in impressions of possibility and offering. He was being asked if he wished to commune directly with the moonwell, to experience rather than merely observe its nature. Atreus hesitated briefly, remembering his father's frequent warnings about interacting with unknown magical forces. But this place felt different from the potentially malevolent enchantments they had encountered elsewhere. The garden had tested him not to bar his way but to prepare him for this moment, ensuring he approached with appropriate awareness and respect. With decision made, he knelt at the moonwell's edge and, following the impression received from the wisp, placed his hands gently upon the water's surface. Despite appearing liquid, the luminous substance felt more like cool mist solidified, yielding yet supportive, allowing his hands to rest upon it without breaking through. The sensation reminded him fleetingly of the rare moments when his father had shown him how to feel the world beyond physical perception, how to sense the intentions behind an opponent's movements rather than merely watching their body, how to recognize patterns in seemingly random events, how to distinguish between genuine threats and illusory dangers. Those lessons had always begun with physical stillness paired with mental alertness, creating receptivity that transcended ordinary observation. As his hands settled more fully onto the moonwell's surface, he noticed how the luminous patterns beneath shifted in response, not randomly, but in ways that seemed intentionally communicative, like a language composed of light and motion rather than sounds or symbols. These patterns flowed up through his palms, along his arms, and gradually throughout his entire body, creating tingling awareness that felt both foreign and strangely familiar, as if awakening something that had always existed within him but had remained dormant until this moment. The moment contact was established, Atreus felt a profound shift in his awareness. His physical senses remained active. He could still see the garden around him, feel the cool stone beneath his knees, hear the subtle sounds of night creatures beyond the silver trees. But another layer of perception opened simultaneously, showing him the same environment from entirely different perspective. This expanded awareness reminded him of what he'd experienced during rare moments of perfect synchronization with his bow. Those instances when target and archer and arrow seemed to exist not as separate entities, but as connected points within unified action. His mother had called these moments true sight, when perception transcended ordinary boundaries between observer and observed. But where those experiences had been fleeting and focused primarily on the relationship between hunter and prey, this connection through the moonwell offered vastly expanded scope and duration. He saw the garden as the wisp perceived it, a living network of intentions and connections rather than merely physical plants and stones. He glimpsed it through the awareness of the plants themselves. Slow, patient existence, measured in seasons rather than moments. Communication conducted through root systems and shared nutrients rather than words or gestures. Most significantly, he sensed the presence that pervaded the entire garden, the consciousness of the woman from the story, transformed but not diminished by her merger with this place. Her awareness touched his gently, without invasion or demand, offering understanding that words could never fully convey. Through this communion, Atreus received knowledge about connections between realms that Freya had suggested he might find here. But the information came not as facts to be memorized, but as perspectives to be inhabited. Brief experiences of how reality appeared when viewed from positions between worlds, rather than firmly within any single realm. He learned that what appeared as boundaries to conventional perception were actually gradients of possibility, areas where reality remained flexible rather than fixed. The moonwell itself existed at one such nexus, explaining its extraordinary properties and the garden's unusual responsiveness to intention and thought. Most importantly, Atreus gained insight into how such connections might be navigated safely, not through force or even specific technique, but through alignment of awareness with the inherent patterns that existed in these threshold spaces. The woman who had become the garden had discovered this knowledge through her communion with the well, had preserved it through her transformation, and now shared it with those prepared to receive it. As this exchange of awareness continued, Atreus found himself thinking of his father, of Kratos' complex relationship with godhood and mortality, with power and restraint, with past actions and future possibilities. The garden's essence seemed to respond to these thoughts, offering perspectives that might help bridge the occasional distances between father and son, when their different natures led them toward different understandings. He glimpsed how his father appeared from perspectives beyond ordinary human perception, not merely as the god of war or even as a father, but as a nexus of potential futures branching outward from each decision, each restraint, each moment of growth or relapse. Through this expanded view, Atreus recognized patterns in his father's behavior previously interpreted as mere stubbornness or limitation. How Kratos' resistance to certain paths often stemmed from profound understanding of their ultimate consequences, rather than simple fear or close-mindedness. Similarly, he perceived his own developing nature with greater clarity than ever before, the unique convergence of divine lineages that created possibilities previously unknown in any realm. Not merely Greek and Jotnar heritage as simple combination, but entirely new potential, arising from their specific intersection within his individual awareness. This recognition didn't increase pride, but rather responsibility. Understanding that unique capacity carried corresponding obligation for careful development and application. The communion also revealed subtle connections between realms that conventional maps failed to capture. How certain locations in Midgard naturally aligned with specific points in other worlds, creating potential passages that required neither magical artifices nor divine intervention to traverse. These alignments shifted according to celestial patterns, explaining why some pathways functioned only during particular seasons or celestial configuration. Time passed differently during this communion. What felt like brief moments to Atreus' transformed awareness might have been minutes or hours in ordinary experience. Eventually, the connection began to gently diminish, not severed, but gradually attenuated, allowing him to return to conventional consciousness without disorientation. When Atreus finally lifted his hands from the moonwell's surface, he found the garden transformed by moonlight. True night had fully claimed Vanaheim while he communed with the well, and now Mani's full face shone directly overhead, bathing the entire glade in silver radiance that complemented the moonwell's blue-white glow. The wisp hovered nearby, its colors suggesting satisfaction and a certain wistful pleasure, as if it rarely had the opportunity to share the garden's deepest nature with visitors capable of appropriate appreciation. When Atreus stood, slightly unsteady after so long kneeling, the wisp drifted in a circle around him once, then moved toward a different path than the one he had followed to reach the well. "You want to show me something else?" Atreus asked, following as the wisp led him along this new route, one of many that radiated outward from the central pool like spokes from a wheel's hub. This path wound through a section of the garden he hadn't explored previously, where plants of extraordinary delicacy grew in formations suggesting musical notation. As he walked among them, these plants released harmonious tones that combined into melodies of surprising complexity and beauty. Atreus recognized elements of Vanir ceremonial music he had heard during their brief, peaceful interactions with that people, though these garden melodies contained subtleties absent from what he had experienced previously. Along this musical path, stone platforms occasionally appeared, their surfaces etched with depictions of dancers in various positions. When Atreus stepped on these platforms, the surrounding plants responded with specific melodic phrases, creating the impression that the path itself offered instruction in traditional Vanir movement art. the coordination of body position with specific sounds to create harmonious interaction with natural forces. Though he didn't attempt to follow these implied dance instructions, Atreus recognized their connection to combat forms Kratos had occasionally demonstrated, movements that flowed with rather than against natural forces, using gravity and momentum to achieve maximum effect with minimum exertion. The parallels suggested common understanding transcending the boundaries between art and warfare, between creation and destruction, between celebration and survival. The path ended at a small circular clearing where a single stone bench stood beneath a canopy of silver leaves. Unlike the semicircle of seats near the storytelling marble, this bench clearly invited solitary reflection. When Atreus seated himself at the wisp's suggestion, he discovered the position afforded a perfect view of both the moonwell and the star-filled sky above, creating a visual alignment between the pool's depths and the cosmos beyond. The wisp hovered before him, its colors shifting into a farewell pattern that conveyed both gratitude for his respectful approach to the garden and a gentle indication that his time here should conclude with this period of reflection. Atreus nodded understanding, and the wisp drifted upward, merging with the silver leaves overhead until its distinct form dissolved into the garden's general luminescence. Left alone in this contemplative spot, Atreus found his thoughts turning naturally to everything he had experienced and learned. The garden had offered not just information, but transformation. Subtle yet significant changes in how he perceived connections between realms, between intention and manifestation, between individual consciousness and broader awareness. He thought of how his father might react to such insights. Kratos remained skeptical of magical knowledge, preferring tangible strategies to mystical perspectives. Yet, over their years of journeying together, he had demonstrated increasing willingness to consider approaches beyond his original training and experience. Perhaps the perspectives Atreus had gained here might serve as bridges rather than barriers in their ongoing collaboration. As he sat beneath the silver canopy, Atreus became aware of a gentle rhythm pervading the garden. Not an audible sound, but a pulsation felt through the bench beneath him, through the air around him, through his own body as it relaxed into deeper attunement with this place. This rhythm matched perfectly the slow, steady breathing pattern Atreus had taught him for finding calm in chaotic situations. In this peaceful synchronization, Atreus found himself drifting towards sleep, not through exhaustion, but through the natural alignment of his consciousness with the garden's restful essence. Unlike the dangerous enchanted slumbers they had encountered in other realms, this approaching sleep felt healing and restorative, a gift offered rather than a state imposed. As his awareness began to shift toward dreams, Atreus had a final, fleeting impression of the woman from the stone tale. Not as she had appeared in those images, but as she existed now. A presence both throughout and beyond the garden, consciousness expanded rather than extinguished by transformation. In this momentary connection, he sensed approval and encouragement for the path he walked alongside his father, despite its challenges and uncertainties. With this reassurance settling into his deepest thoughts, Atreus surrendered to sleep beneath Vanaheim's starry sky, cradled in the living heart of the Moonwell Garden, where wisdom and beauty had been preserved through one woman's extraordinary choice to become something greater than herself alone could ever be. In his dreams, Atreus wandered through landscapes that blended memory with possibility. Paths he had traveled with Kratos merging seamlessly with routes yet to be discovered, familiar mountains overlooking valleys he had never seen. Throughout these dreamscapes, silver leaves occasionally drifted down from unseen branches above, each releasing gentle illumination where it touched the ground, creating stepping stones of light that guided without constraining his exploration. At certain junctures in these dreams, he encountered the wisp again, its familiar pearlescent glow offering silent guidance toward particularly significant vistas or unusual phenomena. Following these suggestions led to extraordinary experiences, witnessing cosmic patterns from perspectives impossible during waking consciousness, observing interactions between realms normally hidden from mortal perception, recognizing connections between seemingly unrelated aspects of existence that reveal deeper harmonies underlying apparent chaos. Throughout these dream journeys, Atreus maintained awareness that he slept in the Moonwell Garden, that these experiences represented neither random imagination nor ordinary dreams, but a continuation of the communion begun at the well's edge, the garden's essence, sharing understanding through imagery and experience that transcended conventional communication. Morning would find him refreshed and ready to rejoin Kratos at their designated meeting place, carrying new understanding that words might never fully capture, but that would nonetheless influence their journey in ways yet to be revealed. For now, the garden held him in peaceful slumber, its silver leaves rustling gentle lullabies as the moon continued its patient journey across the vault of stars above. As Atreus drifted deeper into peaceful slumber within the Moonwell Garden, the silver leaves continued their gentle descent, each one dissolving into the soft earth with a whisper of light. The garden's rhythms merged with his breathing, carrying his consciousness across the boundaries of realms and dreams. In this tranquil space between waking and dreaming, where one story fades and another begins to form, we leave the young godchild to his rest. The light of the Moonwell dims in our perception as we turn our attention elsewhere in the Nine Realms, to another tale waiting to be told. From the luminous waters and silver leaves of Vanaheim, our journey continues to a different sacred space, where ancient wisdom takes another form. Listen now as we follow new footsteps through the whispering forests, where the wind carries secrets and the trees remember. Our path leads to the hollow tree, where shadows hold stories and silence speaks volumes. The late afternoon sun filtered through the ancient forest canopy, casting dappled shadows across the moss-covered ground where Atreus walked. He had ventured farther than usual from their cabin, following the trail of a strange bird whose iridescent feathers had caught his eye. The hunting expedition had yielded no quarry, but his curiosity remained undimmed as he navigated the increasingly unfamiliar woodland. Unlike his father, who valued the forest primarily for its resources and strategic advantages, Atreus found himself drawn to its mysteries and stories. The hidden knowledge contained in its ancient growth rings and weathered bark. As the light began to soften toward evening, he crested a small rise and paused, listening to the subtle shifting of the forest sounds around him. The day creatures were quieting, while the night dwellers had not yet fully awakened, creating a rare moment of relative silence that seemed to hold its breath in anticipation. It was during this pause that Atreus noticed something unusual about the densely wooded hollow below him. A faint, golden glow emanating from what appeared to be an enormous tree at its center. Intrigued, he descended carefully into the hollow, bow ready though he sensed no immediate danger. His instincts, honed by months of hunting alongside his father, detected no threat, only an ancient presence that radiated something like patience. Drawing closer, he discovered that the massive oak tree, wider than 3 men standing, with arms outstretched, had been hollowed over centuries, creating a chamber large enough for someone to sit comfortably inside. The inner walls of this natural sanctuary glowed with a faint golden light that seemed to pulse with the rhythm of breathing. Surrounding the hollow's entrance were intricate patterns carved into the bark, symbols that resembled neither Norse runes nor the Jotnar script his mother had taught him, yet somehow familiar in their flowing forms. They spiraled outward from the opening like frozen ripples in water, each curve and line precisely placed with evident purpose beyond mere decoration. "Strange," he murmured, fingers hovering near but not touching the carvings. "These look old, older than any markings we've found before." The wind shifted, rustling through the canopy above, and for a moment, Atreus could have sworn he heard words carried on the breeze, not distinct enough to understand, but unmistakably speech rather than natural forest sounds. He tilted his head, listening intently as the whisper faded before he could grasp its meaning. "Hello," he called softly, mindful of attracting unwanted attention from the more dangerous denizens of the forest. "Is someone there?" No response came beyond the natural sounds of the woodland preparing for evening. Birds settling for the night, small creatures rustling in the underbrush, leaves sighing against one another in the gentle breeze. Yet the sense of being in the presence of something ancient and aware remained, intensifying rather than diminishing as he continued his examination of the hollow tree. The entrance to the hollow was roughly oval-shaped, wide enough for even someone of his father's substantial build to enter without difficulty. Inside, the floor was covered with a carpet of soft moss that glowed with faint bioluminescence, providing the golden light he had observed from outside. The inner walls were smooth, as if polished by countless hands over centuries, and bore similar markings to those outside, though these appeared to spiral upward toward the opening above, where branches spread outward like protective arms. Atreus hesitated at the threshold, remembering his father's frequent warnings about unknown magical phenomena. Kratos approached all such discoveries with deep suspicion, born of bitter experience, a caution that had kept them alive through numerous encounters with the more hostile aspects of the Nine Realms. Yet something about this place felt different, not threatening but inviting, as if it had been waiting specifically for him. Just a quick look, he promised himself, carefully stepping inside the hollow space. The moment he crossed the threshold, the whispers intensified, still indistinct but unquestionably present, seeming to emanate from the very walls surrounding him. The sound reminded him of conversations heard from another room, words muffled, yet carrying emotional tones that hinted at their significance. He closed his eyes instinctively, concentrating on the whispers, as one might strain to hear a distant melody. Gradually, a pattern emerged. The whispers strengthened as twilight deepened, the transition between day and night somehow facilitating clearer communication. With each passing minute, as golden daylight yielded to the soft blue of evening, individual words became distinguishable among the susurrations. Remember when the Vanir walked freely, before the war that divided the gods, when the seasons turned in perfect harmony? Atreus's eyes widened as he recognized mentions of events from before his birth, perhaps from before his father's arrival in these northern lands. The tree, it seemed, was somehow preserving memories of the forest itself, storing them within its living tissues, like knowledge inscribed in the pages of a book. A fluttering sound above drew his attention upward. Perched on a gnarled branch that extended into the hollow's interior sat an owl of unusual appearance, its feathers shifting between earthen brown and silver grey, depending on how the fading light struck them. Most remarkably, its eyes glowed with the same golden luminescence as the moss beneath Atreus's feet. The owl regarded him with unblinking attention, head occasionally tilting as if assessing his worthiness to hear the tree's secrets. Unlike the owls Atreus had encountered while hunting, this creature showed no fear or intention to flee from human presence. Instead, it settled more comfortably on its perch, feathers fluffing slightly before smoothing again in a gesture that seemed almost welcoming. "Are you the one speaking?" Atreus asked softly, addressing the owl directly. The bird made no sound in response, but blinked once, slowly, the golden light of its eyes briefly intensifying. Below, the moss beneath Atreus' feet pulsed with corresponding illumination, suggesting some connection between the owl and the living energy of this place. As twilight deepened toward true evening, small points of light began rising from the forest floor outside the hollow tree. Fireflies awakening for their nightly dance. They drifted in through the entrance, filling the chamber with gentle, rhythmic flashes that synchronized perfectly with the pulsing whispers. Within minutes, dozens of the luminous insects surrounded Atreus, creating a living constellation that moved in patterns too ordered to be random. The boy stood transfixed, watching as the fireflies traced shapes in the air, outlines of figures that might have been Vanir gods, animals now extinct from these woods, celestial configurations from seasons long past. Each pattern lasted only moments before dissolving and reforming into something new, yet each conveyed meaning that resonated with the whispers growing ever more distinct around him. "I should probably get back," Atreus murmured, aware that his father would grow concerned if he remained absent much longer. Yet the thought of leaving before understanding what this place wanted to share with him felt impossible. The whispers had taken on an almost beseeching quality, as if imploring him to stay just a little longer, to hear what had remained unspoken for ages. Making a decision, he settled himself against the inner wall of the hollow, his back pressed against the smooth wood that felt unexpectedly warm against his spine, almost like a living thing. From his belt pouch, he retrieved the small carved whistle he used to signal his location to his father during hunts. 3 short blasts would indicate he was safe but would be delayed, a code they had established for situations just like this. After sounding the signal, he returned the whistle to his pouch and relaxed more fully against the tree wall. The contact seemed to strengthen the connection, whispers flowing more coherently into his consciousness, as if the barrier between himself and the tree's memories had thinned through direct touch. "Let me hear your stories," he whispered back to the tree, closing his eyes to focus entirely on the sounds surrounding him. The whispers responded immediately, organizing themselves into more coherent narratives, though still carrying the ethereal quality of wind through leaves. The first story emerged clearly, carried on the twilight air. When the world was younger and the frost giants had not yet retreated to their icy realm, a daughter of the Vanir came to this forest seeking sanctuary. Fleeing the escalating conflict between her kind and the Aesir, she carried with her seeds from Vanaheim's sacred groves, living treasures she could not bear to abandon to destruction. Here, in soil untouched by divine war, she planted those seeds, with tears of both grief and hope, establishing new life that carried memories of a realm increasingly closed to mortal access. As the whispers narrated, the fireflies arranged themselves into the shape of a woman with flowing hair, kneeling upon the ground with hands pressed into soil. Atreus watched, entranced, as the luminous figure rose and walked in a spiral pattern across the invisible stage created by the hollow's interior, seemingly planting seeds that blossomed into tiny points of brighter light. Those first plantings became the eldest trees of this forest, sentinels carrying knowledge from another realm, watchers who remember what came before and what may yet come to pass. They grew slowly, patiently, observing the changing of many seasons and the rise and fall of numerous mortal civilizations. They witnessed the Aesir's gradual dominance over these lands, the retreat of older powers, the shifting of boundaries between realms once freely traversed. The firefly tableau shifted, forming the outline of the forest seen from above, certain points glowing more intensely to indicate the positions of these ancient sentinel trees. Atreus realized with a start that he recognized this map. These special trees corresponded to landmarks he and his father had encountered during their hunts. Distinctive specimens they had used for navigation without knowing their true significance. "I've seen them," he whispered, leaning forward eagerly. "The great pine on the northern ridge, the twin beeches by the river ford, the lightning-struck oak that still grows despite its scars. These are the Vanir trees, aren't they?" The whispers seemed to approve of his insight, intensifying briefly before continuing their narrative. The owl above shifted slightly on its perch, its golden eyes fixed on Atreus, with what might have been approval. Among those first plantings was the seed that became this very tree, positioned at what was once the heart of the Vanir settlement in these lands. Here stood a temple open to the sky, where mortals and gods communed freely before such interactions were forbidden by Odin's decrees. This tree grew as the temple declined, absorbing memories from those who prayed, celebrated, mourned, and taught beneath its gradually expanding canopy. The fireflies rearranged themselves to show the outline of a simple circular structure surrounding the young tree, with figures moving in rhythmic patterns that suggested ceremonial dances or ritual processions. As the display continued, the structure faded while the tree grew larger, eventually standing alone as the sole remnant of what had once been a place of significance. When this tree reached 300 years of growth, a great illness swept through the forest, carried on winds poisoned by conflicts among realms beyond mortal understanding. Many trees perished, including several of the original Vanir sentinels. This tree survived, but was changed, hollowed by forces that would have destroyed lesser living things, transformed into a vessel capable of preserving what might otherwise be lost. The illuminated insects formed the image of winds swirling destructively through the forest, trees bending and some falling, while the central figure, representing the hollow tree, wavered but remained standing, its interior gradually emptying to create the space where Atreus now sat. Since that transformation, this tree has served as keeper of forest memories. Stories told by wind and rain, by creatures who shelter among its roots or branches, by mortals who rest in its shade unaware of its true nature. It listens, remembers, and occasionally, when the proper listener appears at twilight's threshold, it shares what it has gathered across centuries of patient observation. The whispering paused, as if allowing Atreus time to absorb what he had heard thus far. The fireflies dispersed from their narrative formations, resuming their more natural drifting patterns, while maintaining the gentle synchronization with the tree's pulsing energy. Above, the owl adjusted its position, wings briefly stretching, before resettling against its body. In the momentary silence, Atreus considered the implications of this encounter. His mother had often spoken of the forest as a living entity deserving respect rather than merely a resource to be exploited, a perspective his more pragmatic father acknowledged but did not fully embrace. Here was confirmation of her wisdom, evidence that the woodland contained knowledge and awareness beyond what ordinary observation might reveal. "You've gathered so many memories," Atreus said softly. "Do you remember everything that happens in the forest?" The whispers returned, flowing around him like a gentle current. "Not everything. Memory requires attention, and even we cannot attend to all that occurs within our reach. Like mortals, we remember most clearly what carries emotional significance or repeats with meaningful frequency. The first snowfall of each winter leaves stronger impression than the 10th. The death of an ancient wolf echoes more powerfully than a fallen branch. Conversations weighted with purpose remain when casual words fade. This selective remembering reminded Atreus of his own experience, how certain moments from his training with his father or lessons with his mother remained crystalline in recall, while entire days of routine activities blurred together into indistinct impressions. Even beings as ancient as this tree experienced the natural filtering that memory imposed upon experience. "Have others like me come here before?" he asked, curious whether previous visitors had received similar welcomes. "Few possess the necessary awareness to perceive our communication," the whispers replied. "Most mortals sense only vague discomfort or peace in our presence, attributing such feelings to ordinary imagination rather than external voice. Those with divine or giant blood occasionally perceive more clearly, though many remain too focused on immediate concerns to pause and truly listen." The fireflies formed a loose procession of figures approaching and then passing the tree, most moving quickly without pausing, some stopping briefly before continuing, only rare individuals entering the hollow, as Atreus had done. The visualization conveyed the tree's long-standing solitude, despite being surrounded by constant activity, a patient witness largely unnoticed by those it observed. Just as Atreus prepared to ask another question, the whispers resumed with a subtle shift in tone, moving from historical narrative to something more immediate and personal. "The child with divided bloodlines sits within our memory chamber, carrying potential futures as numerous as our leaves. We have waited for one such as this, neither fully god nor entirely mortal, capable of hearing voices from root and branch, from earth and sky. One who might understand the delicate balance between knowing and becoming, between memory and possibility." Atreus felt a chill run through him despite the comfortable warmth of the hollow. The tree was speaking about him specifically now, recognizing something in his nature that set him apart. His dual heritage, Greek god from his father, Jotnar from his mother, had already marked him as unusual, but hearing it acknowledged by this ancient consciousness made the reality more tangible somehow. "You know who I am?" he asked softly, uncertain whether direct interaction would strengthen or disrupt the communication. The whispers responded immediately, swirling more closely around him like a gentle breeze seeking direct contact. "We know what you carry within your blood and bone. We recognize patterns of possibility that flow through you like sap through our branches. You are junction point, crossing place, meeting of streams that should not converge, yet have created something new in their joining." The fireflies gathered more densely around Atreus, their light revealing that the moss beneath him had begun growing upward, tendrils curling gently around his boots without restricting movement, not capturing but connecting, establishing physical link between boy and tree. The sensation was strange but not threatening, a living touch that communicated curiosity and cautious optimism. "There is another name that echoes within you," the whispers continued, tone softening further. "A name of significance in times to come, in paths that branch outward from where you now sit. We have heard it whispered by ravens that serve the one-eyed watcher, spoken in tones of both fear and anticipation." Atreus tensed slightly, knowing instinctively what name the tree referenced. "Loki," he said, the syllables falling heavily into the twilight air. "My mother named me Atreus, but the Jotnar murals named me Loki. I still don't understand what that means. For me, for my future." The owl above made its first sound since Atreus had entered the hollow, a soft, low hoot that seemed to resonate with the tree's whispers, harmonizing rather than interrupting. Both tree and bird appeared to be considering how best to address this complex question, measuring what knowledge might help rather than burden the young listener. Names carry power, the whispers finally resumed, but not determination. They suggest pathways but do not forge chains. What matters is not what you are called, but what you choose to answer to, which voices you heed when they summon different aspects of your nature. The fireflies formed two distinct humanoid shapes, one small and straightforward like Atreus's current form, the other taller and more complex, with shifting details that never remained stable enough to fully comprehend. These two figures stood facing each other, neither dominant nor submissive, simply coexisting as different expressions of shared potential. Both names are true, neither name is complete. You exist at the convergence of bloodlines that were never meant to join, creating possibilities unforeseen by those who believe they control fate's weaving. This gives you freedom other players lack, the ability to move between established patterns, to create new designs where others see only fixed tapestry. This perspective offered comfort, suggesting his dual nature provided opportunity rather than conflict, choice rather than predetermined outcome. Yet Atreus still felt the weight of uncertainty, the responsibility of potential that might manifest in ways he could neither predict nor control. But how do I know which path to take, he asked, voicing the question that had troubled him since discovering his Jotnar heritage and its associated prophecies. How do I choose rightly when I don't fully understand what either name truly means? The moss tendrils around his feet pulsed with gentle luminescence, sending waves of light spiraling upward through the hollow's interior. The whispers, when they answered, carried a quality of ancient wisdom tempered by compassion for mortal uncertainty. The question itself reveals wisdom beyond your years. Many never reach the understanding that choice exists. They follow paths laid before them without questioning whether alternatives might be possible. You already seek to choose consciously, rather than simply becoming what others expect or fear. The firefly display shifted again, forming a series of branching paths that spread outward from the central figure representing Atreus. Some branches glowed brighter than others, some faded into darkness, while still others pulsed with changing intensity, suggesting futures whose likelihood shifted with each decision made or unmade. We cannot tell you which path leads to greatest harmony. Such knowledge lies beyond even our long remembering. What we offer instead is this wisdom. Listen always to the quiet voice within that survives when pride and fear fall silent. Your mother recognized this voice and trusted it, above all external guidance. This inner knowing transcends names and expectations. It springs from the essence that exists before and after all temporary identity. As the whispers spoke of his mother, Atreus felt a tightness in his chest, grief still fresh despite the passage of time since her death. He had taken comfort in discovering more about her through their journey, learning of her Jotnar identity and the careful preparations she had made for their future. Yet, each new revelation also brought fresh questions about how much she had known and chosen not to share. Did she come here? He asked suddenly, following instinct rather than careful thought. Did my mother ever sit where I'm sitting now, listening to your whispers? The response came immediately, suggesting this question touched on memories readily accessible to the ancient tree. She came when heavy with child, when you grew within her but had not yet drawn first breath. She rested against these walls, communing silently for many hours as twilight deepened to night and then lightened toward dawn. What passed between her consciousness and ours remains private. Sacred exchange between mother and forest regarding a child of unique destiny. But know this. She left with greater peace than she arrived, her path clarified though not simplified by what was shared. This revelation sent a wave of emotion through Atreus, connection to his mother through shared experience, the knowledge that she had sought wisdom from the same source now speaking to him. He placed his palm flat against the inner wall of the hollow, imagining her doing the same, separated by years yet linked through this living touch point. "I wish I could have known her better," Atreus whispered, allowing himself a moment of vulnerability rarely expressed around his more stoic father. "There's so much she never told me. About herself, about our family, about what she saw coming." The owl descended from its perch, gliding to settle on a knot in the wood near Atreus's shoulder. Though it made no sound, its presence offered wordless comfort, a gentle acknowledgement of loss that transcended ordinary communication. The fireflies around him slowed their movement, their light softening to a steady, warm glow, like countless tiny hearthfires. Her silence was not absence of trust, but presence of protection, the whispers offered gently. Knowledge carries weight. Timing of revelation determines whether that weight crushes or strengthens. She measured carefully what your developing spirit could bear at each stage of growth, preserving your childhood while preparing for inevitable awakening. This perspective helped ease the subtle hurt Atreus had sometimes felt when discovering how much his mother had kept from him, the complex identity she had concealed, the preparations she had made without explanation, the knowledge of his own nature she had withheld until after her death. Through the revelations of their journey, children living between divine and mortal worlds face unique challenges. The whispers continued. Too much awareness too soon invites alienation from ordinary experience. Too little leaves them vulnerable to manipulation by those who would use their power for external purpose. Your mother walked this balance with remarkable wisdom, allowing natural development while establishing foundations for later understanding. The fireflies formed the image of a seedling breaking through soil towards sunlight, growing neither too quickly nor too slowly, developing according to its inherent nature while responding to environmental conditions. The visualization conveyed complex interplay between predetermined potential and adaptive response that characterized all healthy growth. She named you Atreus with purpose, a name carrying meaning in your father's original homeland, while concealing your significance from those who might seek the one called Loki. Not deception, but protection, creating space for self-discovery, unencumbered by external expectations or fears. This insight into his mother's naming choice added another layer to Atreus' understanding of her foresight and care. The name had always felt right to him, comfortable in a way he couldn't fully articulate. Now he recognized it as deliberate gift, an identity that honored his father's heritage while shielding him from premature association with prophecies he wasn't yet ready to comprehend. Your mother understood balance between knowledge and mystery, the whispers continued. Some things must be discovered through lived experience rather than simply told, truths that cannot be intellectually grasped until emotionally realized through direct encounter. Her guidance continues through what she set in motion, through preparations that reveal themselves when circumstances align with readiness. The owl shifted position, golden eyes fixed on Atreus with unmistakable intelligence. In those luminous orbs he glimpsed momentary reflection of his mother's gaze, not her actual presence, but similar quality of seeing beyond immediate appearance to deeper potential. The resemblance brought both comfort and renewed grief, complex emotions that mingled without contradiction. As twilight deepened further toward true night, the whispers took on yet another quality, more immediate, more focused on present circumstances rather than ancient history or abstract potential. Beyond knowledge of past or future lies the wisdom of present moment, the ability to exist fully within each passing breath, each heartbeat, each shift of light through leaves. This is what the forest teaches to those willing to listen, beyond words, to the deeper rhythms that sustain all life. The fireflies descended, forming a loose circle around Atreus that pulsed in perfect synchronization with his breathing, slowing when he exhaled, brightening when he inhaled, creating visual representation of the life force flowing through him. The effect was mesmerizing, drawing his awareness to the simple miracle of continued existence, the countless complex processes occurring within and around him, without conscious direction. Your father seeks this wisdom through different means, through discipline of body, through control of breath and movement, through mastery of impulse. The martial path can lead to the same stillness as contemplation, though few walk it with sufficient awareness to transcend mere physical skill. This observation about Kratos surprised Atreus, offering perspective on his father's rigorous training and seemingly emotionless approach to combat. He had witnessed moments when his father entered states of perfect focus, movements flowing with precision that appeared almost effortless despite their devastating effectiveness. Was this another form of the present moment awareness the tree described? The warrior and the listener ultimately seek the same center, the whispers confirmed, responding to his unspoken question. Different paths to the still point where true power resides, not in doing but in being, not in force, but in perfect alignment with what is. The insight resonated with observations from their journey, how his father's most effective actions emerged not from frantic effort but from centered clarity. How his own most accurate archery occurred when he stopped trying and simply allowed the shot to manifest through him rather than from him. Different approaches leading to similar states of alignment with natural flow rather than resistance against it. This balance proves particularly vital for those carrying divine heritage, the whispers continued. Power without centering becomes destructive force. Knowledge without wisdom becomes burden rather than gift. Many gods fail to understand this essential truth, wielding abilities without the grounding that prevents corruption. The fireflies formed vague outlines of figures Atreus recognized from stories and limited encounters, Baldur consumed by his own obsessions, Thor wielding power without restraint, Odin endlessly seeking knowledge, yet never finding satisfaction. Each visualization conveyed disconnection between tremendous capability and fundamental balance, resulting in suffering for both the gods themselves and those affected by their actions. Your dual heritage offers opportunity to transcend limitations of both divine and mortal perspectives, potentially combining power with compassion, knowledge with humility, longevity with appreciation for impermanence. This integration represents a path rarely walked, but desperately needed as realms face increasing instability. This framing of his mixed bloodline as potential advantage rather than complication offered fresh perspective on what Atreus had often experienced as burden or source of confusion. Perhaps the very aspects of his nature that seemed contradictory could become complementary when properly understood and accepted. As he pondered these insights, he became aware of a subtle change in the forest sounds beyond the hollow tree. The normal evening calls of birds had fallen silent, replaced by the careful movement of something large approaching through the underbrush. Deliberate steps that betrayed neither haste nor uncertainty. He recognized the pattern immediately. "Father," he said softly, not in alarm but acknowledgement. The owl reacted to this word, head turning toward the hollow's entrance with golden eyes gleaming in anticipation. The fireflies drew back, maintaining their formation but creating space for whatever might enter their sanctuary. The whispers continued but softened, becoming background texture rather than focused communication. Moments later, the massive silhouette of Kratos appeared at the entrance to the hollow, his broad shoulders nearly filling the opening. His expression carried its usual stoicism, though Atreus had learned to recognize the subtle signs of concern beneath the impassive exterior. A slight tension around the eyes, the deliberate control of breathing that suggested recently suppressed urgency. "Boy," Kratos said simply, eyes quickly assessing the unusual environment, the glowing moss, the synchronized fireflies, the owl with unnaturally golden eyes. His hand remained near but not on the handle of his axe, prepared for trouble but not assuming it without evidence. "You did not return." "I found something, father," Atreus replied, gesturing to the space around him. "This tree, it holds memories. It shares stories at twilight. It knew mother." Kratos' expression remained guarded. Decades of experiences with godly deceptions and magical traps having taught him well-earned caution. Yet he also recognized the genuine wonder in his son's voice, the absence of fear or distress that would indicate immediate danger. "What manner of magic is this?" he asked, addressing the question to Atreus but glancing at the owl with narrowed eyes, correctly identifying it as something more than an ordinary forest creature. Before Atreus could formulate a response that might adequately explain the complex experience, a familiar voice spoke from the pouch at Kratos' belt. "Ah, the Whispering Hollow. I thought such places had vanished entirely from the realms." Mimir's animated head sounded genuinely excited, his usual sardonic tone replaced with scholarly enthusiasm. "A memory vessel from the days when Vanir influence ran strong in these forests. Quite extraordinary to find one still active after all this time." Kratos lifted the head from his belt, holding Mimir where he could observe the hollow's interior more clearly. The former advisor to Odin blinked appreciatively at the owl, offering what might have been a small nod of respect. "You know of this place?" Kratos asked, his tone suggesting that explanation better be forthcoming and convincing. "Not this specific tree, no," Mimir clarified, "but the concept certainly. The Vanir created such vessels throughout territories they wished to maintain connection with, even after physical presence became untenable. Living archives, you might call them, unreasonable of knowledge designed to preserve cultural memory through times of absence or oppression." The whispers intensified briefly at Mimir's explanation, as if confirming or perhaps supplementing his account. The owl tilted its head, golden eyes fixed on the animated head with what appeared to be recognition. "The Vanir understood better than most how knowledge preserved might serve future generations," Mimir continued, warming to his subject with scholarly enthusiasm. "Unlike Odin, who hoards information for personal advantage, they created these memory vessels as gifts to whoever might prove worthy of receiving accumulated wisdom. Quite enlightened approach, really. It responds to Atreus, specifically," he added, noting the interaction between boy and environment. Likely recognizing his Jotnar blood, the Giants and Vanir maintain generally cordial relations, unlike their mutual disputes with the Aesir. Many of these memory vessels were programmed, as it were, to share their gathered wisdom with future generations of allied bloodlines. Kratos absorbed this information with typical economy of expression, weighing potential benefits against risks. His protective instincts remained strong, yet he had learned through their journey thus far that his son possessed connections to this realm's magical elements that could not be severed through simple prohibition. Connections that might prove valuable if properly understood and controlled. "What has it told you?" he asked Atreus directly. The boy considered how to summarize the complex narrative he had received, the historical accounts, the personal insights, the subtle guidance regarding his dual nature and uncertain future. Many things, he began carefully, about the forest's history, about the Vanir who planted the first trees here, about how this tree became hollowed and began preserving memories. He hesitated before adding, "It told me Mother came here before I was born, that she sat where I'm sitting now." This last detail captured Kratos' attention more fully, a flicker of something, surprise, perhaps curiosity, briefly disrupting his stoic expression. His relationship with Faye had been built on mutual respect for boundaries, each accepting the other's need for certain privacies, that she had sought counsel from this ancient entity without mentioning it, aligned with her self-sufficient nature, yet suggested depths to her preparation for their son's future that continued to reveal themselves even after her passing. After a moment of consideration, Kratos made a decision, ducking his head to step through the entrance and into the hollow itself. The space, though large for a tree cavity, barely accommodated his substantial frame alongside Atreus' smaller one. He settled himself against the wall opposite his son, legs crossed in a posture rarely adopted except during rare moments of meditation. The fireflies adjusted their formation to include this new presence, their synchronized flashing now encompassing both father and son in shared rhythm. The moss beneath Kratos remained inert, however, establishing no connecting tendrils as it had with Atreus, respecting boundaries the warrior had maintained throughout his long existence. "The tree has been telling me about the Vanir who first planted this forest," Atreus explained, eager to share what he had learned, "and about Mother, though it wouldn't tell me exactly what they discussed when she came here. It said some things need to be discovered through experience rather than just being told." Kratos nodded slightly, this perspective aligning with his own approach to his son's education, providing necessary instruction while allowing space for personal discovery through direct engagement with challenges. Some lessons could not be merely transmitted, but required embodied understanding, developed through practice and experience. "It also spoke about my names, about Atreus and Loki," the boy continued, watching his father's reaction carefully. "It said names suggest paths, but don't determine them. That what matters is which voices I choose to answer to." "Wise perspective," Mimir commented from his position now resting on Kratos' knee. "Names carry expectation and history, certainly, but never complete determination. I've known beings who transcended their given identities entirely through sheer force of will and clarity of purpose." "What does it want?" Kratos asked, the practical question cutting through mystical atmosphere with characteristic directness. Atreus considered this, realizing he hadn't questioned the tree's motivation in sharing its accumulated wisdom. "I don't think it wants anything," he replied slowly. "It remembers. It shares when someone can listen. It's not like the gods or other beings we've met, who always have some agenda." He glanced at the owl, which had returned to its higher perch to accommodate Kratos' presence. "I think it's more like a library that speaks." "The lad's assessment is likely accurate," Mimir contributed from his position now resting on Kratos' knee. "These Vanir creations weren't designed to manipulate or recruit, merely to preserve and transmit knowledge that might otherwise be lost. They represent one of the more benevolent applications of divine power I've encountered across the realms." As if responding to this discussion of its nature, the whispers organized themselves into clearer communication once more, addressing both occupants of the hollow. "The guardian of blood and the child of convergence rest within our memory chamber as twilight yields to night. One listens with openness, one with caution born of wounds inflicted by false gods. Both paths hold wisdom necessary for the journey ahead. Trust and skepticism in proper balance create true discernment. Kratos showed no surprise at being directly addressed, having long since abandoned expectations of normalcy where divine or magical entities were concerned. He did, however, raise an eyebrow at the title bestowed upon him, Guardian of Blood, suggesting responsibilities beyond mere fatherhood. Implications he would need to consider when time permitted deeper reflection. The child has heard stories of past and glimpsed shadows of potential futures, the whispers continued. For the Guardian, we offer different insight, perspective on the present moment where true strength must be cultivated. The fireflies surrounding Kratos intensified their illumination, creating a pattern reminiscent of a warrior in perfect stillness before action. Potential energy contained but not suppressed. Awareness expanded beyond personal boundaries to encompass environment as extension of self rather than separate battlefield. You seek to protect the child from consequences of divine heritage, a worthy but impossible task. What can be achieved instead is preparation for inevitability, development of capacity to navigate rather than resist what comes. The current that drowns when fought may become the path when ridden with skill and proper timing. These words touched on Kratos' most fundamental concern, his inability to shield Atreus completely from the complications of godhood, from the attention his unique bloodline would inevitably attract from powerful entities throughout the realms. The suggestion that preparation rather than prevention represented the more viable strategy, aligned with conclusions he had reluctantly begun forming throughout their journey thus far. The wisdom of the warrior lies in knowing which battles must be fought, and which are distractions from true purpose, the whispers continued, seeming to respond to Kratos' unspoken thoughts. The greatest protection you offer comes not through shield or weapon, but through example, showing how divine power may be carried without surrendering to its worst temptations. This perspective struck closer to Kratos' carefully guarded hopes than he might have expected from an entity with no previous knowledge of his complicated history. His entire approach to fatherhood had been shaped by determination that Atreus would not repeat his mistakes, would not become the monster he had been before finding purpose beyond vengeance and destruction. And what is his true purpose? Kratos asked suddenly, the question emerging from concerns he rarely articulated directly. What becomes of him when divine heritage fully awakens? The question hung in the twilight air, fireflies pausing momentarily in their rhythmic flashing as if the entire hollow considered how best to respond to this fundamental uncertainty. Atreus himself held his breath, equally invested in whatever answer might come, having wrestled with the same question since learning of his Jotnar lineage and its prophetic implications. When the whispers resumed, they carried a quality of careful consideration, words chosen to illuminate without imposing artificial certainty on what remained genuinely undetermined. Purpose is not bestowed but discovered, often through paths that appear initially as detours or mistakes. Divine heritage provides potential without guaranteeing outcome. Tools that may build or destroy depending on choices made at crucial junctures. What awakens within him will reflect what has been cultivated through example, through challenge overcome, through values demonstrated rather than merely spoken. The fireflies resumed their movement, forming branching paths similar to those shown earlier, but now with both father and son represented at the central junction point. Their combined choices creating possibilities neither could manifest alone. The visual suggested partnership rather than mere protection, mutual influence rather than one-directional guidance. The future remains unwritten, the whispers concluded, though many believe their predictions constitute inevitable reality. In this space between certainty and possibility lies your greatest power, to act from center that remains true, regardless of external pressure or expectation. Atreus glanced at his father, noting the subtle relaxation in his posture that suggested these words had found resonance. Kratos rarely spoke of his hopes for his son's future, focusing instead on immediate survival skills and practical knowledge. Yet beneath that pragmatic approach lay deeper purpose, desire to offer his child freedom from the manipulations and expectations that had defined his own divine existence. "The Hollow speaks of balance," Mimir observed quietly, his usually verbose commentary subdued by the contemplative atmosphere. "Between knowing and becoming, between heritage and choice, between protection and preparation. Quite profound wisdom, particularly for beings often dealing in more absolutes." As these words settled around them, the owl descended once more, this time landing on a root formation that emerged from the hollow's floor between Kratos and Atreus. In the bird's golden eyes, something shifted. A momentary glimpse of consciousness more ancient than the merely avian. Awareness that had witnessed centuries of forest life, while maintaining its own distinct perspective. The owl tilted its head toward Atreus, then toward Kratos, then back again, as if comparing what it perceived in each. After this careful assessment, it opened its beak and released not the expected hoot, but a series of soft, melodic notes that echoed strangely within the hollow chamber. Neither bird call nor human speech, yet somehow communicating more effectively than either. The moss beneath them responded to this unusual sound, its luminescence intensifying while pulsing in patterns that matched the owl's melody. The fireflies, too, synchronized their flashing with these new frequencies, creating visual representation of what could only be described as harmonic resonance throughout the living system that comprised the hollow tree and its attendant consciousness. "Extraordinary," Mimir whispered, "a direct harmonization attempt. Extremely rare, with non-Vanir visitors. The tree consciousness appears to be establishing deeper connection with both of you simultaneously, tuning disparate frequencies toward potential consonance." Atreus felt the resonance physically, a subtle vibration moving through moss beneath him, up through his body, seeming to align something within his own being that had previously existed in slight discord. Not dramatic transformation, but gentle recalibration, like instrument strings being carefully tuned for improved harmony. Glancing at his father, he noticed Kratos experiencing similar effects, though with characteristic restraint in outward response. Only someone who knew him well would recognize the slight shift in breathing, the barely perceptible relaxation around his eyes, the subtle alteration in how his massive frame settled against the tree wall, all indicating internal response to whatever harmonizing influence flowed through the hollow. "What's happening?" Atreus asked softly, directing the question to whoever might best explain the unfamiliar sensation. "Attunement," the whispers replied, flowing around and through the owl's continuing melodic emissions. Alignment of disparate rhythms towards shared resonance, not erasing difference, but finding complementary relationship. Father and son carry separate patterns necessary for journey ahead. Together they create third pattern, unavailable to either alone. The fireflies formed double helix pattern between Kratos and Atreus, two distinct strands flowing in parallel while periodically connecting through bridging points of light. The visualization conveyed relationship between separate but complementary forces, individual identity maintained while participating in larger, integrated system. "Time grows short," Mimir observed quietly. noting how the fireflies had begun drifting toward the hollow's entrance, their synchronized patterns gradually dissolving into more natural movements. The communication window afforded by twilight approaches its close. Such vessels typically return to dormancy with full nightfall. Atreus felt a pang of reluctance at the thought of leaving. There were countless questions he still wished to ask, histories he wanted to hear, guidance he hoped to receive regarding the complexities of his dual nature. Yet he also recognized wisdom in limitations, in allowing space between revelations for integration and personal reflection. "Will we be able to return?" he asked, directing the question both to his father and to the tree itself. "To hear more stories another day," the whispers answered, already fading as true night descended upon the forest. "The hollow remembers those who listen with respect. Return at twilight when moon stands half-known in sky. Time when boundaries thin, most naturally between knowing and mystery. Bring questions that arise from true need rather than mere curiosity. What serves genuine growth will find answer. What serves only impatience or fear will meet silence." Kratos nodded slightly at these terms, recognizing reasonable boundaries rather than arbitrary restrictions. He rose to his feet with characteristic economy of movement, ducking his head beneath the upper edge of the hollow's entrance. "Come, boy. We return home while light still guides our path." Atreus stood more slowly, placing his palm once more against the inner wall of the hollow in silent gratitude for what had been shared. The moss beneath his feet gradually retracted its connecting tendrils, releasing him without resistance, while maintaining faint golden glow that would likely fade as they departed. "Thank you," he said simply, addressing the tree directly. "For your stories, for your wisdom, for speaking to my mother when she needed guidance." The owl hooted softly in acknowledgement, wings spreading briefly before resettling. The remaining fireflies formed a brief path toward the entrance, providing gentle illumination for their departure. The whispers had grown too faint for distinct words, yet conveyed farewell through subtle shifts in tone and rhythm. As they exited the hollow tree and stepped into the forest now fully embraced by night, Atreus felt changed in ways difficult to articulate. Not dramatically transformed, but slightly recalibrated. His understanding of himself and his potential futures expanded without becoming overwhelming. He carried new questions alongside new insights, balanced in proportion that invited contemplation rather than anxiety. "What do you think, Father?" he asked as they began navigating the return path, guided by Kratos' unerring sense of direction even in deep darkness. "About what the tree shared? About Mother coming there before I was born?" Kratos was silent for several paces, considering his response with characteristic thoroughness. When he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of careful reflection rather than hasty judgment. "Your mother sought wisdom where she found it, preparing for challenges she foresaw. This tree appears to continue her work, offering perspective without demanding action, suggesting possibilities without claiming certainty." He glanced down at his son, expression softening slightly in the darkness. "Its counsel aligns with what experience has taught me, that fate offers patterns but not prison, that divinity brings power but not purpose, that choice remains even when path narrows." Coming from his typically taciturn father, this philosophical assessment represented remarkable openness, perhaps influenced by the contemplative atmosphere they had shared within the hollow tree. Atreus treasured such moments, when glimpses of Kratos' deeper thinking became visible through his protective armor of stoicism. "A tree's perspective on your names carries wisdom," Mimir contributed from his position secured once more to Kratos' belt. I've observed countless beings across the realms who became enslaved to identities bestowed by others, fulfilling prophecies through belief in their inevitability rather than any true predetermination. The power to define oneself beyond expectation remains among the rarest and most valuable freedoms. Do you think we should return when the half moon comes? Atreus asked, returning to practical consideration of future engagement with the hollow tree's consciousness. Perhaps, Kratos replied, neither committing nor refusing. We will consider what questions merit asking, what guidance serves true need rather than momentary curiosity. He adjusted his direction slightly, identifying landmarks barely visible in the darkness. Knowledge without purpose becomes burden rather than strength. They continued through the dark forest in comfortable silence, each processing the encounter according to their nature. Atreus with eager contemplation of new perspectives, Kratos with careful assessment of potential implications for their security and journey, Mimir with scholarly consideration of how this discovery connected with other magical phenomena encountered throughout the realms. The night air carried unusual clarity, stars shining with exceptional brightness overhead, occasionally glimpsed through gaps in the forest canopy. Atreus found himself listening differently to the woodland sounds surrounding them, hearing not just practical information about potential threats or resources, but layers of communication he had previously overlooked. The rustling leaves, the creaking branches, the soft calls of nocturnal creatures, all carried fragments of the larger story the forest continuously told to those willing to listen, beyond immediate concerns. It feels different now, he observed softly, like the forest has always been talking, but I'm only just starting to understand the language. Awareness expands through attention, Kratos responded, this simple observation carrying subtle acknowledgement of his son's developing perception. What seems new has always existed, waiting for recognition. This perspective echoed what the hollow tree had shared about selective memory, how attention determined what registered as significant, how consciousness shaped experience through what it chose to notice or ignore. Perhaps the whispers had been present throughout Atreus' life in the forest, audible only now that he had learned to recognize their subtle frequencies. As their cabin came into view, warm light spilling from its windows onto the surrounding clearing, Atreus carried with him the tree's most essential wisdom, that names and bloodlines suggested pathways, but constructed no chains. That listening to the quiet voice within provided guidance when external voices clamored for attention. That presence within each moment created foundation for whatever future might eventually unfold. Kratos paused at the edge of the clearing, his hand briefly resting on his son's shoulder. Rare gesture of physical connection that communicated more than words might express. The touch conveyed acknowledgement of shared experience, recognition of developing maturity, perhaps even subtle pride in how Atreus navigated complex revelations with increasing discernment. Rest tonight, he said simply. Tomorrow's training begins at dawn. This return to routine contained no dismissal of their unusual encounter, but rather healthy grounding in ongoing practical development. The hollow tree's wisdom had emphasized balance between knowing and becoming, between contemplation and action, perspective that aligned with Kratos' instinctive understanding that growth required both reflection and disciplined practice. As they crossed the threshold into their cabin's familiar warmth, Atreus felt unusual sense of completeness, not final resolution to the many questions surrounding his identity and destiny, but temporary equilibrium between curiosity and acceptance, between desire for answers and willingness to allow understanding to unfold naturally through experience. The hollow tree had offered not definitive explanation but context for continued exploration, framework that made uncertainty feel less threatening and more like necessary space for genuine development. That night, as he drifted towards sleep beneath firs warmed by the cabin's hearth fire, Atreus could still hear faint echoes of the tree's whispers, not demanding attention, but offering gentle reminder of connections extending beyond immediate perception. Roots reaching deep into soil nourished by countless seasons of growth and decay, branches extending towards skies witnessed through centuries of changing weather, memories preserved not as static records but as living wisdom available to those who approached with respect and genuine need. The half-moon mentioned by the tree would appear in its appointed time, marking opportunity for return engagement with the ancient consciousness that had recognized something significant in his divided bloodline. Whether they would accept that invitation remained undecided, a choice to be made after careful consideration rather than immediate response to wonder or curiosity. Yet, regardless of future visits, something valuable had already been integrated, perspective that created space between prophecy and person, between divine heritage and individual choice, between knowing and becoming. In that space, true freedom might be discovered. Not absence of limitation, but presence of genuine choice within whatever circumstances arose. As consciousness yielded to dreams, fireflies danced behind Atreus's closed eyelids. Not random patterns, but meaningful configurations, suggesting possibilities yet to be explored, potential awaiting conscious participation in its eventual manifestation. The forest continued its whispered communication through the night, stories flowing like gentle streams around their cabin, carrying memory and possibility in equal measure for those with ears attuned to hear beyond immediate sound, to deeper significance beneath. In the days and nights to come, these whispers would integrate with his developing understanding of himself and his place within the complex tapestry of interwoven realms. Not answers to every question, but illumination upon the journey itself. The path walked together with his father toward whatever awaited beyond currently visible horizons. And so our journey through the realms draws to a close for tonight. May Hypnos, god of sleep, watch over you as you drift through dreams of legendary proportions. If these tales of gods and monsters helped guide you to restful sleep, consider supporting our journey by liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Your support gives me the strength to continue sharing these stories night after night. Remember, these videos play uninterrupted through the night, with no ads to disturb your slumber, just the soothing sounds of mythic realms to accompany your dreams. For those seeking passage to exclusive content, our Patreon offers early access to all videos and special playlists crafted to enhance your sleep. The link awaits in the description below. Until our next journey together, may your sleep be deep, your dreams be mighty, and your rest be undisturbed by the conflicts of gods and men. Sleep well, brave one.